Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Amanda Gold, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Brittany Hanks from Homegrown Traditions, to talk to us about balancing working from home and balancing having your children at home, whether that's homeschooling them or doing online distance learning. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic. I know it's a topic that lots of people are very interested in. Schools are going back across the country right now, and everyone's kind of adjusting to this new school year. Will you give us a little bit of a background on yourself, your blog, how you got started, and just tell us why you're an expert on this topic?
Yeah, so I started Homegrown Traditions about 2.5 years ago, and it started as solely a product-based business just around building family traditions. I've got 4 kids, 12 down to 5. And so I started sharing our products on Instagram, and then I kind of started throwing in some different ideas for how to organize your home or simple recipes or systems to set up at home that would make your life a little more simple as a mom. And then we moved to just a full content-based business. And now I share just practical ideas for moms to simplify their life. And I've done a lot of research on that topic, and I share a lot of tried and true tips on that specifically. So I think it's been a little bit of a crazy year for all of us. And even those of us who said like, oh, I would never homeschool, and now we're homeschooling, right? Or even, doing virtual learning with our kids. So I think we've all had to shift, and I feel like I'm learning with everyone else, but hopefully we'll be able to share some ideas that will be useful for people who are in this crazy situation.
Well, we really do appreciate your time. And the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that with COVID-19, this pandemic happened, there's so many unknowns happening right now. What is your number one piece of advice for parents who are now having their children at home while also working from home?
So I think my number one tip, and one thing that I've had to realize going through all of this myself, is to just focus on what you can control, because there's so much that we can't control. There's, decisions that our schools are making. There's decisions that our workplaces are making. There's, people giving their opinions, solicited or not. And there's just a lot that feels like, gosh, I have no control over my life. But there are certain things that we still can control. And I think instead of focusing a lot of our energy and worrying about all of these things that are constantly changing and that we can't control, it's helped me a lot to just instead kind of let all of that go, decide that I'm going to go with the flow of whatever decisions or things happen, and focus on the things I can control. So some of those things that we can control are like figuring out a school situation that works for your family. So we've all had to decide, like, are we going to do the public school thing? Are we going to try homeschooling? Are we going to do virtual? Are we going to do in person? That's something you have control over choosing. And I think most of us have at least some time of our kids home and doing learning from home. So we have control over how that's going to look in our own specific home, where we're going to set up a learning space for our kids, what that will look like. And also we get to decide what information we take in. Sometimes if it's just too much, then we can, close the internet, not be on social media for a few days to just kind of recharge. And then taking care of ourselves and our family, we can still choose to try to be healthy, get the amount of sleep that we need, and find ways to kind of release some of that stress.
I want to talk a little bit about specific scenarios first. So this specific scenario, your child is 3 days virtual and 2 days in person. So they kind of have that hybrid learning situation going on. How do I create a schedule for those virtual days so that my child actually has a structured environment that they're going to have when they actually go in person? What are some of your tips for that?
So that is a tricky situation, but one that I feel like a lot of parents are in right now. That kind of hybrid situation. Our schools, once we go back, are actually like 1 week in school and 2 weeks virtual. But I've heard a lot of, like you said, the 2 days on, 3 days off, or like even Fridays off. And I think the struggle there is that when kids go to school and then all of a sudden they're at home, they're like back in summer mode. They're thinking like, oh, great, I get to sleep in, I get to stay up, I get to, play outside. And so it's a little hard to shift from like school mode to being at home, but also having requirements in school that you need to meet. So my biggest tip for that is to, number one, like communicate with your kids. Let them know what the expectations are up front. Let them know this isn't a vacation day. We're not in summer mode. There's actual assignments that need to be done. And if they're not done, then you're going to go back to school and you're going to be behind and you're going to be playing catch up. And I think also just making sure that timing wise, like kids actually really thrive with routines. So whatever your set wake up time is for those days that they're attending school, keep that wake up time for the days that you're doing virtual learning. You know, if they're waking up at 7:30 or 8 or whatever it is, wake up at the same time on every day during the week. And then try to keep like the lunch breaks at the same time. Try to kind of format their day at home similar as you can to how it would be during a school day. And then that transition will be a little bit easier. And then also making sure that they go to bed at a normal time on those nights, even when they're going to be home the next day. It's just going to be harder to get up and get going and get into school mode if they've stayed up way too late. So I think just having the routines, especially around different time blocks during the day, is going to help just, keep the steady flow from going back and forth.
And as a parent too, I mean, I'm working from home. How do you match your schedule to theirs? Is that even a thing that you should consider? Should you try to wake up at the same time as them? I mean, you may be waking up earlier, but should you try to put your breaks at the same time as theirs? That way it makes it a little bit easier for you if they're working for doing school from home, or is it better to have different schedules than your child if you can?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like it depends on, well, the age of your kids is probably going to be really dependent on that, because like my 12-year-old can pretty much go through her whole virtual school day independently. So when she's working, I can also be working. And so it's more beneficial to have like our breaks and kind of work time structured at the same time. But my kindergartner, it's very different because he needs a lot of help when he's in school. So I can't really work as much at the same time that he's working. And I think that also depends on how your school has set it up. I know some schools, when you're doing your virtual or at-home learning, they'll have like most of the content be the first half of the day, for instance, and then it's a lot lighter the second half of the day, or maybe they even just have like some packets or stuff to do from home. And so I think it kind of depends on the age of your children, if you really need to be a part of their virtual learning, or if they're older and can kind of take accountability for that and do it all on their own. But I think there is some benefit, at least at the end of the day, to have like a set we're done time. And maybe you have like a set lunchtime too. When everyone's taking their lunch break, you can all just come together, kind of relax for a minute before you jump back into both work and school. And even if you have to catch up with some work at night, I feel like if you can set aside a couple hours, 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 or 6 to 8 or whatever it is that you normally had during a work day, that you can just like take off the teacher hat, take off the work hat, and your kids don't have to be, your students anymore. They can just be your kids again. I think that's important and critical to have like that downtime together where you can just be a family again and kind of have fun and enjoy your time together.
And a lot of that will really depend on the employer too. I think during all of this, it's really important. I was talking with someone about this earlier today about culture of an employer and making sure that your employee understands the situation you're in and that you're able to kind of adapt and adjust to what happens. Because yes, your child might be in in-person school right now, but what happens if something changes? So
Yeah.
being able to adapt your schedule and figuring out what works best for you is definitely going to be a conversation you have to have with your employer as well.
Absolutely. And I feel like teachers too, like I feel like communication is critical. And even like I've realized that a lot of our teachers don't have kids at home. And so for me to tell them, hey, I just want to like be upfront. I've got 4 kids. I'm trying to go back and forth between all of them, make sure they're in the right place at the right time, but like we're not going to be perfect. And I feel like they have a lot of understanding for that, but you do need to communicate it. And especially if you say, this is my work schedule. And so during these hours, like I'm not going to really be available, like just making it clear to both your employer and your teachers what the situation is so that they can both hopefully be a little bit flexible and you can get into a situation that works for both.
That was actually a question that we got, was about having different age children too. So if you have 2 or 3 kids who are all in different grades, how are you able to, or what's some tips and tricks you have on giving them the attention that they need throughout the day? So let's say you have a first grader, a 6th grader, and a junior in high school. How do you kind of go about your day to make sure that they all have the attention they need if they do need help from you?
So I think, yeah, that is a tricky thing because younger kids are just by the nature of being younger going to need a lot more help and a lot more hands-on help throughout the day to get signed on to their classes and for you to check in and make sure they're getting through their work. Whereas older kids, the older they are, typically the more independent they are, and they may need little, if no help, to get through their virtual learning day. And so it is important to find time with each of them, and maybe even, letting your older kids know, hey, I'm helping like this younger child during these morning hours, but if you have any questions, like I'm totally available for you during the lunch hours or in the afternoon when the younger child is done. So communicating that to them. But one thing we've also done, well, and I think it's important to remember as well that you weren't with your kids 24/7 during normal school anyway, so you don't, I don't think you need to feel guilty if you're having to spend a little more time helping one child navigate through school, or if you've got to set aside some time to just close the doors and get some work done, as long as you make an effort to kind of like I mentioned before, put the work away at some point and connect as a family. But one thing we have done with our kids for the past couple years is each of our 4 kids has a specific night of the week that they're assigned. And on that night, it's called their special time, and they get 15 minutes of time alone with just that child and my husband and I. And it's worked really well because especially in an environment like this where everyone is home all the time, there is almost no chance for one-on-one interaction. And so even though it's only once a week and it's only 15 minutes, it's been a huge blessing for us to just have that one-on-one time with the kids. And our only rule is that it can't be screen time, but they get to choose if we want to play a quick game together, or sometimes they just want to color or talk or whatever it is. And so even just having that really short chunk of time devoted for like one-on-one attention, I think helps them know that like, okay, I'm going to get that time with mom and dad. It's not going to be interrupted by other kids. And so that's been really beneficial with just the chaos of having everyone home 24/7.
You mentioned screen time. Another question we keep getting a lot is that as parents, we try to be mindful of the amount of screen time that we're giving our children. And with distance learning, children are literally spending all of their time in front of a computer. Is this bad for them? And also, what types of activities can we do with our kids after school is done to kind of reprieve them of screens and get them to do other things?
Yeah, so I think as parents, we're all worried about that, right? Like you hear from your pediatrician, like your kids shouldn't be spending more than 2 hours a day in front of any type of screen. And now we're having this virtual school where some kids are in front of a screen for 7 hours, and that's like required to get through all the work they need to get through. But I think it is important to remember that not all screen time is created equal. So screen time required for school, whether it's Zoom calls or they're working on an assignment, is definitely not the same as like plugging your child into some type of gaming system for 7 hours. Like it's not having the same negative effects. And so, but one thing that we've talked about is, and I think we're going to start this next week when we go more into like a full almost 7-hour day of school, and a lot of that will be in front of screens, is that once they're done with school, there really isn't that much time after school before bed. And so I think we're going to move to like a weekends only as far as like additional screens, whether it's playing a game or whether it's watching a movie, just because they need time outside. Like they need to move their bodies. They need that break from just looking at a screen all day. And that's obviously going to be a lot harder for teenagers because their way of connecting with friends is largely based on screens. So you'll have to work with them to set some boundaries there. But I think encouraging kids to go outside and play, and sometimes they need a little help doing that. Sometimes they need help getting started. You may need to go out with them and, kick around a ball for a while, give them some ideas of things to do outside. But yeah, I think, we tend to worry about it, but I think learning online versus like just here's a computer, go play a game is a very different scenario. So even though it's not ideal, I don't think it's necessarily doing the same amount of harm as just plugging them in front of a screen would be.
And you mentioned teenagers too. I know that the age difference between what your kids are going to be is going to change a little bit about how you do things. But we did have a parent ask us how they can help their teenager start to like follow this structured rule. She specifically mentioned that she has a hard time getting them out of bed sometimes, especially like you mentioned, if you are on virtual days where you don't have to be up at a specific time. But Is there any sort of like reward system that you could do with your children to help them kind of follow a structure and create these boundaries, specifically for teenagers, but also for younger kids? Like, how do you motivate someone to stick to this specific schedule? I know it's hard for me sometimes working from home. I'm like, oh, I should wake up every day at this time, but
Yeah.
sometimes you just don't want to. So, what are your tips for that?
So I asked a lot of my friends and neighbors who have teenagers specifically about this topic because I feel like I'm just getting into it. My oldest is 12. Um, and the one piece of advice that kept coming back from these seasoned parents of teenagers is that you have to involve them in the planning process. So as kids get older, they want more control. They want less nagging from you. They want to be more independent. They want to have more control over their lives, and they want a little bit less rules and kind of nagging from the parent. And so all of the parents that I talked to said like it's critical to involve them in the conversation. If you set out like, okay, here's for my teenager, here's your daily schedule, you need to wake up at this time, here's what you're going to do throughout the day, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback from that because they were not involved in putting that schedule or routine together. So sitting down with them and just talking about, okay, we're starting a new school year. Maybe it was a little rough in the spring. Let's talk about some things we can do differently. Let's work together and set some expectations, set a routine, and get that in place and have so that they're totally buying into it, so that they're a part of the planning process. And there's going to be a lot less pushback. So, coming together and deciding, okay, this is going to be our wake time and this is going to be our bedtime, and having them agree on that. And then I think with teens, like I kind of mentioned before, screens are a huge part of their lives, whether they have a phone or whether they're communicating with friends just on the computer or whatever it is. And so you really have to be careful with not just giving them total free reign with the screens. And maybe, you say, okay, you've got to finish your work before you get screen time, before you can, go on social media or connect with friends, or even just making sure that they're not charging all of their screens and computers in their room, even if that's where they're doing the bulk of their work. If you have like a charging station that is separate from their rooms, then they actually physically have to get up. They've got to go get the screens, and it will kind of get them moving. But I think the biggest thing is having them buy into that, and then also asking them what types of rewards they want. I think kids or teens are pretty easy to please. Most of the parents I talked to, they said the rewards that were most motivating were around food and friends and screens. So those three things are pretty easy to give teens. Like, you don't want to give a reward that is not motivating to them, right? Like maybe it's something that you feel like would be motivating for you, but if it's not motivating for them, then there's really no point in doing it. If you want to have like some allowance tied to it, you can. I know some parents, don't want to have money be a part of it. So it could be something as simple as like, okay, you get your work done throughout the week, and then Friday we're going to go to Chick-fil-A for lunch. Or, we're going to order a bunch of pizza on Saturday night if you've completed all your work for the week, and you can invite a bunch of friends to eat it outside together, whatever it is that's going to be a motivator for them. But I think keeping in mind that like food, friends, and, screen time are huge motivators. And if there has to be consequences for if they're not getting things done, also ask them to contribute to that conversation as well. Have them help you set the limits. And I feel like with kids, most times, they're pretty reasonable when you ask them what the consequences should be or what the structure of their day should be. And then if you have a very set outline for what their routine's going to be and what the expectations are, and they've bought into it, they've helped create that, then I think you're going to have a lot less nagging just because, you have that set in place. And then I think also having a little bit of flexibility. So say you set a routine and a week or two in, your teen's like, I hate this is not working. Be flexible to adjust as well. Like allow them to come to you with those concerns and maybe reevaluate and say, okay, I said you couldn't have screens till 5 p.m. I realized that friends are texting and things are going on earlier. Let's also add in a lunchtime screen time where you have 15 minutes to kind of check in on things. So being a little flexible there, but I think the key thing is just involving them in the conversation.
You mentioned the word routine a lot too, and I think that's really important to think about as a parent. Like, what routine can I set in place? And I never thought about the fact that your teenager or even like your middle schooler probably doesn't have their phone on them 24/7 at actual school. So
Yeah.
removing it from the room is a great idea. And you also mentioned having chargers in another room. What about creating a space in your house? If you do have the ability to, should you put them in a separate room so they're by themselves, or is it better to kind of have them out in the open for you to check in on?
So yeah, that's one thing that we've kind of had to work through. We're a couple weeks into our remote learning, and we had a playroom that I kind of turned into our learning room because I realized, okay, whatever the situation looks like, yes, there's a ton changing. Maybe they'll go back to school, maybe they won't. Either way, like we're doing a lot of learning from home. And so I really wanted to have a set space for them to feel like they could get into school mode. So even if you don't have like a separate space, even just having like a bin of their school stuff, and as soon as breakfast is done, you bring out everyone's bin, you put it on the dining room table, or everyone has set areas they go to. But initially I was thinking, okay, all four of my kids, I'm going to have up in that learning room. We're all going to be working together. And it didn't quite work out because everyone's on Zoom calls at the same time. So like when they have to speak, then there's like other people on calls, and it was just getting to be a little too much. So my 12-year-old now does most of her work like downstairs in our office, and she can go through most of that herself. So if the kids are independent and you have older kids, then it's probably actually easier for them. If you have other kids, it's maybe easier for them to be in a space where they're not distracted by you helping the younger kids, and they're just able to kind of get through their work. My younger kids, so my other three younger kids are still up in that space, and that's worked really well. And I even set up a desk for myself up there because they're getting more independent. It is getting better as we go. Like the first week I was like, this is insane. Like I'm going from kid to kid. They're like, I can't hear. The other kid's not on mute. And the teacher's like, you got to mute your computer. So, but kids catch on to things fast, and they're learning. And even my 5-year-old, he knows how to log in. We put his little student number on his computer, and he types in the numbers, he gets logged in, he can join his call. And so their independence will get better even if you have young kids. And so it's been actually great this week because they all know how to get into their calls, they have their headphones. So I set up a little workstation for me up by them, because occasionally they still do need help, or I need to make sure that they're not like walking away in the middle of a call. But I'm actually able to get quite a bit done right around them, which is nice. Like I just take my computer up there and I work while they're on their calls, but I'm still very easily accessible if they need help. So that's been that's worked well for us so far, to be close and I can get some stuff done, but they can also access me if they need help with something.
I want to talk a little bit specifically about what the kids are learning in school too. I know that I've heard a lot of this parent guilt of not feeling like their child is able to learn as much because they're not in person, or they don't have the attention they normally get with a teacher. As a parent, how do you kind of tell yourself it's okay that this might not be perfect and they might not be learning everything maybe they would have learned in person, but it's going to be okay, they're not going to fall behind? Like, how do you take a step back from everything and give yourself a break?
Well, the thing that I keep going back to is the fact that everyone is in this situation together. Like, I think I would feel a lot more stressed and a lot more worried about their education if we were in some type of a situation where like everyone was going in person all day, every day, and like my kids were in this environment where we're trying to do this virtual learning on our own. But I just keep going back to, if this is hard for me, this is hard for everyone. Like we're all in this together. And I'm sure it's even a lot harder for other people who, have a different situation or a more demanding job or whatever it is. Like we're all in this situation together. So I do think it's not optimal to be in the virtual learning environment. I think especially for really young kids, there's so much benefit to being in person, but that's something we can't control when they go back or when they don't, or even if they start in person and end up having to go virtual, that's something we can't control. So I try not to worry about it. But it does bring me a little bit of peace of mind to realize everyone is in this situation together. So if all of our kids are learning a little bit less, hopefully we'll just be able to catch up in the next couple years, but we're all in it together. It's not like, your kids are missing out on something that other kids are getting. So I think we're all just doing the best we can and it'll even out over the next, couple of years when hopefully things normalize.
And on that point too, I know that a lot of people are worried about if they have a senior in high school and what happens for next year. And I do know there's a lot of colleges that are kind of getting rid of some of the requirements for entrance into
Yeah.
college because they understand how difficult this time is. So if you're a
Hmm.
senior in high school too, I know it's probably extremely difficult to feel like you can't get that scholarship or you can't do this, but just know that the next step, the higher education, is also feeling the same way, and they will
Absolutely.
work
Yeah.
with you for whatever you have.
Hmm.
I want to talk a little bit about parents with their employers. So, how can parents work with their employer to negotiate flexibility in their schedule? And are there any sort of ideal hours when, as a parent, we should be present for our kids? And ideal hours for us to kind of focus just on work. I know you mentioned earlier taking off like between 5 and 7 or 6 to 8, but is there other periods of the day that we should try to step back from our own work to focus a little bit more on our kids?
Yeah, I think there's, especially with younger kids, a few critical times during the day when it's going to be hugely beneficial for you to be there with your kid. And obviously, that's going to vary. Like, for instance, all of my kids' meetings during the day, all of their Google Meets are live. They're in person. They have to be on at a set time. They're not watching a video that was pre-recorded from the teacher. Whereas other schools are the opposite. Like, everything is pre-recorded, and so you can kind of do it on your own time. So it'll depend on the situation that you're in, whether you have a little more flexibility to like go through your child's content when it fits into your day, or whether you're like a situation that I'm in where they have very specific times and they have to be on time to these live calls. And so I do feel like, especially the ones at the beginning of the day, like I think teachers know that kids are going to lose a little bit of focus like after lunch in the afternoon, and there still may be calls, but I think it's probably most critical for you to be hands-on at the beginning of the day. And if they have 3 or 4 calls or whatever it is throughout the day that they have to be to on time, it's going to be really helpful for you to step out of work mode and just help them get plugged into that, and make sure that they're getting going. And then I feel like as they get more independent in that, you can step back a little, or you can even train them on, if you've got like an Alexa, or if they are an older child and they have like a phone, to set alarms so that they can know, okay, I have a meeting that's starting in 5 minutes, or in 30 minutes, whatever you want the warning time to be. I've heard of a lot of people using like their Alexa or some type of thing to like set a bunch of alarms, and each child has like a different sound. So I think trying to automate some of those systems is going to help your kids be more independent. But I would plan for, especially when your kids are just starting out, if you haven't started school, just know that like the first week is going to require a lot of hands-on as you work through this new situation with kids and make sure they know how to navigate it. But it does get easier as it goes along. So if you're able to communicate that to your employer, like, okay, this is the week that my kids are starting school, or even from 9 to 10 in the morning is when like I really need to be hands-on with my kids, because that's when they need to get onto their live calls, and I can kind of go through the plan of their day during that time. So the communication part is key, and it will kind of depend on your situation with both school and your employer. So I think just finding a system that works, and also giving yourself, trying to have, I mean, you don't necessarily have a ton of control over what's happening at work, but if you're able to kind of lighten your load the first week or two of school while your kids are adjusting to it, and then picking up more of the work that you may have missed either in the evening or on the weekends those first couple weeks, then I think you'll get into a flow of being able to do both.
I love the Alexa idea. I think that's a great idea. Hopefully, I don't set off my
Yeah.
Alexa saying that. I also, I think as an employer too, like I said at the beginning, you have to be flexible. And the idea of maybe as a parent blocking off like 10 minutes at the top of the hour of your calendar, if you do have that ability, that way you can make sure your child gets on the phone call and then go to your meeting. So maybe from like 9 to 9:15, you make sure you don't have
Yeah.
meetings, and then you go back about your day. Or I love the idea of catching up on work when you can. And I mean, yes, employers just need to be flexible right now, and need to make sure that their employees are happy and that they're still getting this balance of work, but also home. So lots of things to consider for the next couple of weeks. And I know that one of our counties here in Utah hasn't started school yet. They start after Labor Day and they're going full remote for the semester. So
Mm.
that'll be interesting. It's a long period of time for parents. So hopefully this helps them kind of get some tips and tricks. My
Yeah,
last
I hope
question
so.
for you is about how we as a parent can get our child up and active during the day. I know you mentioned taking breaks and going outside, but is there things that we can do to have them not be so just sitting in a desk all day? I know I do it. I just literally sit in a desk all day, but as a child, you need that physical activity a little bit more. What are some games or some situations that you can do to kind of get your kid out of the room and get them more active?
So yeah, that was probably one of the biggest challenges that we realized after our first week of remote learning, because the kids kind of have calls at different times. And so they were all having downtime at different times too. And so I was realizing like whoever wasn't actively on a call or working on an assignment was just kind of laying around, like they couldn't really play with a sibling because other siblings are working. I'm trying to help the other kids. And so they were, constantly saying, I'm bored, or they're interrupting other people's Zoom calls. And it was just kind of a mess. And so we actually sat down with our kids and we said, this is a problem. Like, we need to figure out what to do with this. And obviously, I think it's a very easy go-to for kids to be like, oh, just let me like play a game on the computer real quick while I'm waiting for my next call to start. Or, oh, let me have the tablet, or let me, screens are a very easy thing to just like plug your kid into when it's like, okay, I need 15 minutes to help this other kid or to get something done at work. But like we already talked about, with so much screen time already, you want to avoid that as much as possible. And so we brainstormed a huge list of things that the kids could do if they have a short break, if they have a 15 to 30 minute, even an hour break, and they either have to do it on their own because other kids are working, or maybe a couple kids have a break, but I don't want them to be on the screen. So some of the things that we wrote down were read a book or listen to an audiobook, ride bike or scooter in the driveway. I have a bunch of toy bins that are like marbles or Legos or trains. Get out one of those, take it down to your room, play with that. Jump on the trampoline, paint or draw a picture, play an instrument, do a sewing or craft project, sidewalk chalk, write in a journal, play with a ball outside. And I think it could be helpful to just have a few different like activity bins. If you want to put together like a bin of, like my kids really love like the plus blocks. So you get like a bunch of plus blocks. Maybe you go to a craft store and you get a bunch of their really cheap, just craft things that are like little paint on wood thing, like whatever you think your kids will enjoy. That you don't have to spend a ton of money in it, but even just creating some bins for your kids to choose from, to just say, okay, you got some downtime, pick a bin of stuff that you want to play with. Maybe one of them has some outdoor stuff, sidewalk chalk, bubbles that they can go out and do outside for a little while. So I think setting them up for success there is going to be huge. And also asking, I think it was helpful to ask my kids their ideas as well, because then they don't, I think sometimes I have to remind my kids all the time. I'm like, I'm not your entertainer. Like, I'm not here to entertain you all day. Like, you are creative, but sometimes kids want to be entertained, right? And that's what screens do for them. It's instant entertainment. They don't have to even think about it. But when kids are pushed to be creative, they're very creative. But sometimes you're going to have to, listen to whining for 5 minutes while they complain about being bored. And then they go find a box and make like this amazing creation. So I think you have to realize like it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but also if you kind of set them up for success to like, okay, grab a bin of activities, go do something with that. Then you kind of are able to just like give them a jump start into doing something creative and using their mind in a way that doesn't involve a screen.
I love the idea of creating bins or having a list that already exists and then kind of saying, okay, this is your menu of things that you love to do. Go pick one and kind of figure out what works best for you. I think that's really great. I know there's a lot of parents who set up like sensory bins for their younger kids, and they just have a bunch of options for them to pick for. So I think that's a great idea. It's a good tip to get people out and about. Brittany, is there anything else that you wanted to mention to us just about this balancing of working from home and having your children at home, or anything you wanted to say to people?
I think one thing that is important to remember, and that I have to constantly remind myself, is that this is all temporary. And we're all just a roller coaster on this roller coaster of emotions. And, it can be very stressful at times, But I think it's very important to give yourself grace and to just realize that we're all in this together. It's a struggle for everyone. You're definitely not alone in that. And that's hard because we can't be in environments where we're around a lot of people. And so sometimes it can feel very lonely. But I think finding ways to connect with other parents who are going through a similar thing than you and just kind of talking out your feelings, and also realizing that like your best is good enough. Kids are very resilient and they will be fine. So if you're not perfect, or if you're struggling or feeling stressed out, know that you're not alone, but also give yourself some grace there. Know that you're doing the best you can, and that's exactly what your kids need.
Well, Brittany, thank you so much. And for everyone watching too, Brittany put together this really great PDF that you guys can download, print off to look at with all of her tips and tricks and some stuff we didn't get to. So we'll post that afterwards for you guys to view. But we really appreciate this conversation. And if you guys have any further questions for Brittany, you can leave them in the comments below and we'll get to those later. But again, Brittany, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.